Okay. Good afternoon. My name is David Yankelevitz. I'll be hosting this session, session 3, along with Chris Latham. The session is Transforming Thoracic Health for Everyone. What does the field need and what do people need? This is divided into two 1-hour sessions. The first session I'll be hosting. I'm a radiologist at Mount Sinai School of Medicine. Chris, for the second session, is a medical oncologist at Dana-Farber who really specializes in inequities and disparities. For my session, it'll begin with a 10-minute talk, and then we'll have a panel discussion. And the panelists will introduce themselves after the initial talk. So can we first start with the pre-recorded talk? Oh, just one other thing, Rowena Yip will be taking the questions from any panelists have questions, they can send them to Rowena Yip, and the audience can just send them in the regular way. Okay, let's start with the pre-recorded talk.
I'm David Yankelevitz, and I will be leading the session on big data and vulnerable populations addressing the gap. These are financial and research disclosures. For this session, which I'll be also sharing with Chris Latham in the accompanying hour, but for my session, these are the panelists, and they'll introduce themselves during the discussion. In order to think about this topic, we're thinking about the pathway to development of a useful database, and we're focusing here on low-dose CT in the context of lung cancer screening. I think we need to define the purpose of the images. What are we collecting data for? Is it for advanced image processing or visualization? Is it for quantitation? Is it for detection? And I think, at least to an extent, you want to focus on what you're looking to do with the database. Is it for lung cancer? Is it for emphysema? Is it coronary calcium, osteoporosis? Or do you really need to define it completely, because as time goes on, if it's a good database, you'll use it for other health measures that may be available in the images that we're not even aware of. But in each case, the necessary quality needs to be defined. And I think that's a very important aspect of having a database and making it valuable. This is an article that we published a few years ago. This was tumor volume measurements error in the context of a clinical trial. This was a lung cancer trial done with Roche, and we were measuring image quality. And this is from calibration devices that were placed on the patient to see if we could measure things like we hoped for. And A, B, and C are transaxial, sagittal, and coronal views of the Teflon sphere. It's about a little more than 1.5 centimeters. And you can see, at least on that initial scan, that was all done at the same time, looks about the same for the sphere. But then a second follow-up scan was obtained, that's D, and you can see suddenly that sphere in the coronal view suddenly looks a lot smaller, that's the purple line. And then in another subsequent scan, E, it got a lot bigger. Now the calibration sphere didn't change, but clearly there's some distortion here. And finally, slide F, or F here, shows that you can see the green represents kind of the XY plane, and that didn't change very much. But along the poles, north and south, there's a lot of variability in that calibration phantom. And you can see what this does in terms of volume measurement. It turns out in this study, there were 3 manufacturers. And for manufacturer A, you can see the proportional change in volume. And this occurred with 16 slice or less scans. It's enormous. You're thinking about measuring something, a small nodule, this basically makes it unusable. They seem to have corrected the problem to a large extent for their greater than 16 slice scans. But you can look at other manufacturers. Manufacturer C had much less of a problem for 16 slice or less. But for 16 slice or more, there's still a fair amount of error. And when you think about applying this to a 5 millimeter nodule, that percent error may be quite impactful on our ability to measure a small nodule. So these are things that we have to think about. What kind of quality do we need in these databases? And I just show you another example of this. This comes from an experiment that I was involved with, where we looked at 3 rolls of Scotch tape from the center of the field of view out to the periphery with a particular scanner that had that distortion. And just look at that roll of Scotch tape, what happens to it. Imagine if that was a small lung nodule. And finally, I just show this. This is a surface rendered view of a patient, and you can guess which scanner this was on, giving these kind of ripple effects or distortions. Now, beyond the idea of the image quality, we also have to think about the databases and what we're measuring and the size of the database and how useful they are. And I'm just showing, for example, this is in trying to predict whether something is lung cancer. And you can see this group gave ROC curves. They're doing methylation, and they're using particular databases, and they have an area under the curve of 0.76 up to 0.87, depending on whether they combine clinical data with the methylation. And here's another group, and they're using a different process, and they have an area under the curve of 0.73. Another group, and everybody is producing these kind of images, but they're all using different databases with different size cancers. And finally, this comes from Median Technology, which used the NLST database, and they got spectacular performance for predicting whether something is malignant, and they actually come up with an area under the curve that's at 0.99. The question is, how well does this do? Would it do on the other databases, or how well will those other procedures do on this database? And here's where we really need to get larger databases together, because there's really a problem with these small databases and everybody doing something differently, and whether you're producing anything meaningful really at all. Now, to address this problem, a group has been formed called MIDRIC. This is a multi-group 2-year study. It includes the AAPM, ACR, and RSNA, as well as other institutions. And it stands for the Medical Imaging and Data Resource Center. And it's very much been built to accelerate development of AI. And some of these slides that I'm now showing were given to me by Mary Ellen Geiger from the University of Chicago, who's the PI of this project. And you can see all the organizations that are involved and some of the people, very prestigious group. And they have multiple subcommittees, and they've really thought about a lot of the problems for how to collect data, how to distribute data, both on the technical side, the ethical side, and they've done a lot of work in moving towards making this available. They've thought about things like getting good representation of diversity, and they've sort of tagged it to the population of the census data, and you can see census data in blue and MIDRIC data in orange, what they're doing in terms of populations. They've also thought about some of the ethics, and this is an article that they reference, which talks about the purpose of data and whether it really should be usable. Once it's finished its diagnostic purposes, can institutions share the data? And MIDRIC has done a lot of work in terms of developing data use forms and data use agreements that they're making available to institutions to make it easier for them to share their information. I wanted to give you an example of why big data is so, I think, useful. This came out of our LCAP work. And in this paper, we looked at over 50,000 patients to see the amount of COPD. And it turned out that somewhere around 25% of the people had COPD. And among those 25%, almost 3/4 of them didn't even know that they had emphysema. I mean, it's really an extraordinary number. And amongst those, there's a fairly high percentage that actually had severe emphysema and had no idea that they had it. This is some of the things you can do with these large databases. So there's a lot to think about here in terms of making databases useful and some of the challenges. And I just want to throw a few things out there. we have lots of legacy databases, and how they're used can be a challenge. In particular, I think about the coronary artery calcification databases, where they were built using 3mm slice thicknesses. And they've really become entrenched. It's very hard to get cardiologists to think of anything other than those 3mm slice thicknesses because they've used it for so long. But nowadays, we're using much thinner slices. And there's more information in those thin slices. One of the most important things in coronary calcium scoring is a 0 score. But a 0 score on a 3mm slice might not be 0 when you use a thinner slice. The NLST is available, tremendous resource. But those scans are, to some extent, obsolete. 2.5mm slice thickness now is no longer the state of the art. And we have similar challenges with osteoporosis databases, where the databases were built primarily using premenopausal women and then extrapolated to other populations. We have challenges with combining information from different databases. It's not just imaging. We want to include molecular data, genetic, proteomic. How do we do this? These databases aren't all together. And there are mechanisms for doing this, extracting information from the electronic health record. How do we do this? MIDRC has addressed some of these issues, but there's much more to do here. And one of the other problems or challenges really is, how do you establish normal values for diverse populations? Certainly the tools for what we measure are the same in these diverse populations. A nodule size is the same regardless of what the population is, but whether that's a normal value or whether other things that we measure, like bone density, is the same for diverse populations. How do we define these populations? How do we define normal values? And similarly, if we want to build a database that's useful, how do we determine the number of participants so that we can come up with a normal value for these various propositions that we want to measure? How do we obtain data? Well, what are the needs? And here we have to think about the needs of the academic institution as well as societal needs. And this is going to be a topic of great concern. Academic institutions just can't typically give away large amounts of data because there's a cost associated with it. And similarly, there are societal needs for the data. And finally, who gets access? If we build these kind of databases, who has access to them? I know I was personally involved in a situation where LCAP at one point was subpoenaed by Philip Morris because Philip Morris was involved in class action lawsuits to support screening. And they felt they needed to analyze the data from LCAP more carefully than what was available in our published works, and they wanted access to it. But when patients that were, or participants at LCAP found out that Philip Morris might have access to their data, they were already threatening to withdraw from the study. So who gets access to data? Other people have this feeling when it comes to pharmaceutical industry getting their data. So there's lots of considerations about who has access. Does industry have access? And there are many approaches to this. When you build these databases, sequestering certain amounts of data so that it can be used for FDA. These are all considerations that hopefully we'll address in the panel discussion. Thank you.
Okay. So am I speaking? Is it going to? Okay. So we're going to start a question and answer session with all of the panelists. But first, can each of the panelists in my session, in the order that they were listed and the questions I handed out, just give a very brief introduction of who they are, starting with Tony?
Hi, my name's Tony Reeves. I'm a faculty member at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and this is in the engineering college. My department is School of Electrical and Computer Engineering, and I've been working on the image analysis technical aspects for several decades.
Melinda?
Hi there, I'm Melinda Aldrich. I'm an associate professor at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. I'm an epidemiologist, and my work is focused on lung cancer disparities, both lung cancer screening and as well as identifying environmental and genetic contributions to lung cancer.
Great. Dr. Taioli?
Yes,
Hi.
Emanuela Taioli. I'm the director of the Institute for Translational Epidemiology at Mount Sinai, the associate director for population science at the Cancer Institute at Mount Sinai. I'm an epidemiologist and I do disparities in cancer etiology and outcomes.
And you're speaking all the way from Italy.
And I'm in Milan, Italy at the moment.
Next is, who's a Heather?
Hi, my name is Heather Pierce. I'm Senior Director for Science Policy at the Association of American Medical Colleges, or AAMC, and I'm also the Director of Policy of the AMC Center for Health Justice that looks at issues more broadly than medical care. At the AMC, my primary responsibility is on the regulation of science and research, and that includes data sharing. We have a lot of work in that area, and being the liaison between our member institutions, which are all medical schools and teaching hospitals in the U.S., and federal agencies on issues related to data, science, research, and funding.
Last panelist is Eric.
Yeah, hi, David. I'm Eric Liam. I'm the Chief Commercial Innovation Officer for the Mount Sinai Health System and the President of Innovation Partners. And my responsibility broadly spans the development of technology and management of intellectual property, ultimately for launching products for patient benefit.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to have questions for each of the panelists, roughly 10 minutes for each panelist. And if any of the other panelists want to chime in afterwards or make a comment on what was said for that prior sessions, that would be great. So Tony, we'll start with you. What are some of the challenges with CT for development of AI tools and quantitative imaging? And are there a difference between those two missions?
Okay. I could start with the second part of that, are the differences between the missions. And I would say today, there are differences in the missions. AI is an inference method, and it provides categorical outputs as used today. So we ask, is it cancer, is it not cancer? We ask, what is the lung RADS, which is some kind of categorical outcome. Quantitative imaging, we usually use an algorithmic, rule-centric or analysis method, and that provides measurements in the value. So we get a number out, the nodule is 17 millimeters, plus or minus 1 millimeter if we're doing good measurement science. To that, they're both brittle in different ways, in that there are very simple things that can trip them up to give totally incorrect answers, something like a stent or a lung surgery or something like that. And really, the vision for the future is that it's not going to be one or the other, but they should work in harmony and in what we call an ensemble type system, where they both make decisions and reconcile any differences. So I see that kind of how things will evolve to these two things merging. But we're in early days of AI, or the AI of deep learning. So there is some evolution to be done before we achieve that goal.
Okay. My second question was, how important is calibration and standardization? And in particular, in regard to working across different vendors and comparing scans, that sort of thing.
Okay. Well, for AI, you have to train with different vendors to make them vendor agnostic. So you're going to need a lot more training data in that kind of context. For quantitative imaging, it depends upon what the measurement is. So if you're saying density for, say, emphysema, then you need to calibrate the instrument from -1,000 to 0 Hounsfield units. On the other hand, if you're doing bone mineral density, then you need to calibrate the instrument from 0 upwards to measure calcium or calcium coronary artery scoring. If you're doing size measurements, normally we don't really care too much if someone says I've got a 15 millimeter lesion. Well, that's pretty bad. But he says, wait a minute, I made a mistake. It's a 16 millimeter lesion. You go, well, that's not really a huge change in how I appear to respond to that diagnosis, even though a 16 millimeter lesion is 20% larger than a 15 millimeter diagnostically, and the clinical action is not going to be really changed. So if one machine gives you one measurement, the other gives you another, then that's not so much a big deal. On the other hand, if we're measuring growth rate, and if we are foolish enough to measure growth rate by measuring a volume and then measuring it a second time and subtracting the two, and perhaps we take two measurements, one gives you 16 millimeters, the other gives us 17. Now we have a 20% change in volume. That is a very, very big deal. So when we're measuring growth rate, or when we cast that as a volume measurement, we need a very, very highly calibrated instrument if we want to get good outcomes. And so in that case, we should do something that we have never done before, is calibrate a CT scanner for geometric precision. That is something, a totally different task from what the traditional role is of looking at a scan and saying, I see this, which is what a human does when a human looks at a scan, and what AI does when it tries to mimic the behavior of a human. So if we were going to do change in size measurement, which seems to be an important task, then the first thing we should do is demand that each measurement be done on exactly the same scanner with the same protocol, with everything else being constant. We should validate the scanner for geometric distortion, which is no qualification or validation that has ever come from manufacturer or FDA or anyone before. And if we had time, we could remove human image distortions, such as enhancing kernels, overlap reconstructions, that do nothing for the precision of the scan. They are just crutches so that the human visual system has a better time for you wonderful radiologists. So calibration, it depends what you're measuring, and defines kind of the type of calibration you should be doing.
And my last question for you, Tony, is when you think about wanting to build software tools, you know, back in the day when you were involved in building tools for volume measurements, and major vendors took these tools and marketed them and sold them. You know, you built the tools with 50, 100 cases maybe. The manufacturer used, I know, 30 cases. Nowadays, though, we talk about having databases with hundreds of thousands of cases we want. Why is that, and what's the benefit?
Okay, well, there's two parts to that. One is, yeah, I would always like more data, but it was very hard to get it. And in the technical world, if you can get more data, you get better outcomes. You can run more cases. So if I had 50, I would be asking you for 200 or more. The AI of the last few years that has made the huge leap forward has come from a different domain. And to illustrate that, the first innovation, which came out in early 90s, was to identify 10 handwritten symbols. And for that to work, there was a training set of 60,000 cases. The second great innovation was about a decade or so later with ImageNet that came out around 2012 to 2017. And there we had little images that you get on the web. Google was interested in that, as was Facebook. And you say, what is in the image is the task. And there were over 1,000 classes. With the MNIST, there was only 10 classes. And for training sets went into the millions. And with that, they started out having about a 25% error rate. And 7 years later, with many years of 7 years of many different increments in the design, we got the error rate down to 5%, which is better than a human. So this is just the phenomenal thing. This is sort of driven deep learning in vision. If you want to make something robust from AI, you're not using a rule. You can't say, oh, if there's been lung surgery, then do this. If you see something like that, do that. You've got to have examples. So for every issue, every variation, you need to have multiple cases in your training set. I see one place where this has been done for diabetic retinopathy, and they had 150,000 cases in their training set and got very good outcomes. For lung cancer, so far, we've just seen a few thousand cases in the training sets, and the results are pretty, let me just say, less than they could be with such a, in that context, a restricted data set.
Okay, thank you, Tony. So next, I have questions from Melinda Aldrich. Melinda,
Yes.
can you describe some of your experiences in lung cancer research and challenges across different databases?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we're working on most recently is lung cancer screening disparities. And our work was used to help inform the current guidelines. So as we all know, the NLST, while it's a fantastic resource, it's not particularly racially diverse. And so we were able to leverage a resource that's here at Vanderbilt, the Southern Community Cohort Study, which has a large number of African Americans, and able to, that informed our work about changing the screening guidelines. But the challenge with that data set, that it's an observational epidemiologic cohort, so we are not linked to any imaging data. So we're unable to really link the crucial survey, racially diverse data set to the screening outcomes. The best we can do is with CMS data, so Medicare, Medicaid data, which we all know has its own challenges. It's really, built for insurance purposes. So that's one of the challenges we've encountered. We also do, in my lab, work looking at genetic predictors of adverse events for patients on immunotherapies. So we leverage electronic health records, and these have their own unique challenges as well. We're trying to extract that information retrospectively. It's incredibly challenging. We build computational algorithms to try to pull out relevant clinical annotations. And we're very fortunate here at Vanderbilt to have a fantastic biomedical informatics department and team and great infrastructure. But despite all of that, it's just hugely challenging to conduct that type of work. And the observational epi studies often don't have the great clinical annotation. So you get these sprinklings of the relevant variables that you want across very diverse different types of data sets, and it just creates a problem all the way around. The NLST is fantastic, but it doesn't necessarily have all the social, behavioral, environmental factors that we might wish it had. So a number of challenges, really, and depending on the research question that we're asking.
I often see that when researchers such as yourself are doing these studies with large databases, half the time they spend is on what you said, trying to figure out how to make the databases kind of compatible. That's where most of the energy is spent.
Yeah, harmonizing. I mean, we're even, for our immunotherapy work, thinking that there needs to be a paper or a grant just on how to pull out all the relevant information. And a lot of the immunotherapy work is being done in mostly European data sets, which is a cross-institutional project. And most of the populations we have at each of those 3 medical academic centers are European descent. And so it then creates problems when we want to go to translate and generalize our findings. How do we generalize that for racially diverse populations? So agreed.
My next two questions, you probably partially answered. They were, how important is it, especially in regard to lung cancer, to be able to combine diverse data sets?
It's incredibly important. Lung cancer is a multifactorial disease, and so we need to leverage multiple types of information to be able to understand what's driving incidence, what are the outcomes for populations, and how can we improve those, and being able to have various different types of variables is incredibly important, that often not one data set brings. And so being able to harmonize those is very important.
And the third question, I think you kind of answered already, the challenge with individual institutional databases.
There are often different terminologies that are used in different institutions. The data structure might be set up slightly differently. Certainly, EPIC and OMOP, some of these common data models are working towards better harmonizing. I know a lot of efforts in this space, but we have a long way to go in terms of being able to have all that data harmonization that we need to really be able to tackle these questions.
Okay, great. So I'm going to move on to Dr. Teoli.
Yes, I'm here.
Hi. How do we develop databases that are inclusive, and what are the challenges with lack of diversity?
Yeah, so I will start from the challenges, and I thought about it when we thought of putting this together, and clearly some of the database that are available are just not diverse because of the way they're built. And one example, it was already mentioned before, that Medicare, for example, is not that diverse because it includes only Medicare beneficiaries that as such, they have to, by definition, respect certain requirements. And so they're not very diverse. And so those who are from different racial backgrounds are not representative of the larger population with the same racial profiles because of exactly the eligibility of Medicare. Another phenomenon that has been published extensively, for example, using SEER, which is the cancer registry, technically is a population-based cancer registry, that data from racial and ethnic minorities are less complete than data from white patients. So even though the data is technically there, it's not complete. So I would say the real challenges are the lack of representativeness of the data set and the fact that the data are missing or incomplete. Now, in terms of improving this, there are ways to, I think there are ways that this existing database could be improved because they are a resource and a wealth of, have a wealth of data. And one option is to expand the data collection to more a community or public hospital emergency rooms where the uninsured and the less covered populations are looking for treatment. And the other thing is to try to make Medicaid a more integral part of the available data sets, because at the end, Medicaid has a lot of information that could be useful to try to generalize information.
Okay. What are your thoughts about benchmarking to the national, the census data?
Yeah, so this is also an interesting point because the census is clearly a starting point because it's a representation of a population, but still has limitations because not everybody answers the census data, so there's a bias there. Not everybody fills in their ethnic and racial distribution and characteristics. So there could be selection bias there. And patients, very many times patients don't follow the distribution of the census data, even if you have the census data. And one thing that I was thinking of is, for example, Hispanic paradox, where Hispanics are less represented among hospitalized patients. just because they are healthier to start with, at least for what is certain disease. So it's hard to benchmark on the census. But there are other places that we can go for information of the distribution of the populations. We know that a lot of studies use cell phone demographics or driver license demographics. So I was thinking ideally a combination of the three above could be an optimal way of trying to understand the distribution, the correct distribution of the population.
Okay, and my third question for you is thinking about establishing normal values, for these different subgroups, and I can imagine, I mean, EGFR is a popular example, kidney
Yes.
function differences, but I am thinking that there's going to be differences in bone density in different populations or various other things may be different. And how do we start thinking about, if we want to build a database, how many people will need inside that database, that sort of thing?
Yes. So yeah, I think there are several things playing together in blocking a better development of normal values and variations of normal values for populations. One thing is that there is an enormous amount of data out there that is not probably properly leveraged. So none of us has a clear inventory of all the existing sources of data that could be integrated and studied to generate normal values for a lot of biological parameters. And that happens to us every time we're looking for something. We look deeply in the public databases, in the national sources of data, and we always find something there that we didn't know about. The other thing is what you kind of mentioned before, is that sometimes the data are available from a long time ago, and there are minimal diversity in terms of age, sex, race, and we stick with those values for years. And one example is white blood count. We finally came to understand that blacks and whites have different white blood counts, and that's not a pathology, it's just the way people are made. It took a lot of years to figure that out. So one way to me would be to make this normal values more dynamic by feeding the new data constantly into a system that generates outputs of new normal values while they get enriched with more values. And we have a lot of now resources with AI, with natural process languages. So we have ways to generate real-time information. So we would have a dynamic adaptation of our normal values. As you said before, the thickness of the scan diminish. Here we get new normal data for calcium scores and real time generated by this system. And it's a little bit of a utopic thought, but I think we should at least attempt to go in that direction.
Yeah, the idea of having these dynamic bases is very exciting. That keep up with technology rather than locking in. Okay. Next, I have Heather Pierce. Heather.
Yes, hi.
What is the position of the Association of American Medical Colleges regarding sharing of existing data, including benefits and potential harms?
Well, I would say nationally, the movement is towards more sharing. The AMC's been supportive of institutions sharing and finding ways to share their data in ways that are not compliance-based data sharing, but are really usable, that are used to improve science. We've seen federal agencies are moving in this direction too. The NIH has a data sharing plan requirement that it's implementing, meaning that for federal grants funded by the NIH, every grantee has to submit a plan. Now, in theory, that plan could be, I'm not sharing any data unless someone asks for it, right? The plan, at this point, the NIH has not made data sharing itself a requirement, but this is clearly a step in that direction. So at some point, I'm certain a data sharing plan that is insufficient and doesn't demonstrate a real effort to get the data out and for the use by other scientists will be deemed insufficient in a grant. Again, we're not there yet, but I think it's headed in that direction. So I think the power of data sharing is well understood by everyone on this call, the power of reuse of data, of combination of data sets. The harm, to the extent that there is potential harm, is in when we don't do it right. And that could mean a few different things. That could mean a lot of institutional and investigator time and resources spent in sharing data in a way that's completely not reusable. That is a harm. It's a use of a problem with resources. Of the FAIR principles for data, which are pretty well understood now to be a way to think about data sharing, that all data that's shared should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, is a really good way to think about, well, when is the juice worth the squeeze for the important and expensive thing that it is to share data. The other thing I think that we should be aware of is that there are a lot of stories and public perceptions about what data sharing is and isn't. And to the extent that we begin to lose the public trust in what we're doing with clinical and research data, that will make things harder. It makes things harder conceptually, but also in real ways, because legislators respond to public demand and outrage. Federal agencies respond to legislators. And so thinking about how to engage conversations about the sharing of images, data from the electronic health record, data from research records, and make that part of a conversation as a regular part of clinical interactions and research study interactions, we think can be an important piece of normalizing the sharing of data from all different sides.
You know, there's an argument to be made that once the data has been used for its clinical purpose, that there's almost an ethical imperative to use that data for secondary purposes, if possible. I don't know how you feel about that, or your organization feels about that, but that's certainly one of the concepts that I've heard.
I think that there's a good argument to be said. There's information to be learned out there. And I think we need to do that also with some humility and reminders that the data was collected from someone who may have concerns about that or questions about that, or not want to find out about it later, even if it was completely appropriate from an ethical perspective, from a regulatory perspective, from an institutional policy perspective.
Yeah. All right. Second question I had is, how does use of data by industry differ from use of data by other academic groups? And who should determine how freely available it should be?
I think this is one that is debated and feels more black and white sometimes in public perception than in reality. I mean, that the use by the commercialization or the turning of data into something that's usable by patients, by physicians, by researchers, doesn't always happen at academic institutions, of course. And so having a black and white rule that says data use or secondary use by industry is problematic, but by other academic groups is always fine, is actually not always the case. And some of the most concerning issues related to the release or the improper de-identification of data came between sharing between institutions, not just by industry. I think there are ways of sharing the data that depend on what it is, what it'll be used for. To the extent that data are freely available and open, like the open neuro site, which has 616 publicly available databases, many of imaging, MRI and PET scans and others on neuroimaging. Those are available to anyone, industry and others. But when there is a transfer of information to industry or to another academic institution, the rules of the road, the rules of use of that data need to be set up in advance. And those have to follow not only privacy rules and institutional rules, but also whatever you promised individuals through the consent forms that you gave them, no matter when you took that data.
Yeah, I mean, do we think about restricting it, and do we let every high school kid who wants to access it, and especially images where they can potentially, I was reading now that they can take CAT scan images, and we can do surface rendering. And you can do facial recognition on it. You can reconstruct their face, and you can start doing all kinds of nasty things. How do you protect against that?
Well, I think we have rules that in many ways are insufficient to protect against all sorts of nasty things, as you say. But sometimes we try to address these through contractual means. What is the data use agreement that comes along with the data that says if you breach this agreement, if you release the data, if you re-identify people we ask you not to re-identify, then we have a claim against you. In many ways, that's completely insufficient, because once those data have been released, once someone's been re-identified, then resolving things through contractual issues is probably insufficient and is not going to play well from a societal perspective. I think what we would be better off doing is to think about what pieces of data are people okay sharing, and I think we don't ask often enough. What is it okay for anyone? There's a lot of pieces of data about me, imaging, blood values, etc., that I'm fine with any high school student coming up with, right? And seeing and some amazing things come out of high school undergraduate and things, but some things are not. And I think trying to figure out where those lines are and how we can incorporate those conversations in everything that we do will get us a lot farther in. And as I said, normalizing the sharing of data to advance health and science.
And the final question for you is, how should we deal with concerns about credit or ownership of data by those researchers and institutions who collect and provide?
Yeah, something that is on the minds of so many academics. Why would I put in the resource and the data? It's mine. I collected it. I'm going to be publishing on it. Understanding partially there's the going to the altruistic nature of improving science altogether. It gets us only so far. One of the things that we've been working on for the past several years is thinking about how to better reward, credit, and track data sharing. And so some of this involves the potential use of persistent identifiers on data sets that could be cited as individual citations in papers and other publications. Combinations of data sets would be able to trace back to the originators of those data, and in fact be able to be incorporated into CVs, into promotion and tenure packages, to show not only what's the original work you did and where was it published, but instead of focusing on the impact factor of that first journal article or the first through 10th journal articles, to be able to demonstrate in a real world kind of way, what is my actual impact on science? I wrote this paper, and then my data set has been used in these kinds of ways to broaden the area.
That's a wonderful thought. Okay, thank you. And our last panelist is Eric Liam. Eric, describe some of the considerations that an individual institution faces when releasing data, including the costs of the data, collecting the data, protecting investigators' access to data for their research before they release it. Why don't we just give it all away, Eric?
Well, first of all, I think that Heather actually identified a lot of really salient points on related to the sharing or transfer of data. Now, David, one thing I wanted to point out is you actually used the word, I think, implying transfer, release of data. And so, the kind of issues that we think about on a routine basis, and I should say at Mount Sinai some years ago, we put together a committee. I co-chaired that committee to develop policies on the sharing of data internally to ensure that data was generally available. And particularly, we're talking really more about institutional data sets, large data sets, clinical information, what have you. So to ensure that we had data being shared internally between our investigators to optimize the outcomes for research purposes, but then also a external data sharing or data use policy. And we implemented a data use committee, which includes various administrators as well as our faculty, similar to what you'd think of as an institutional review board, but specifically for the use of data. And we've been doing that for a couple of years now and are getting better and better at it. I should also say that we engaged nationally recognized experts to help us to develop some of our policies and some of our practices. So getting back to the question that you asked, of course, we think about, control of data. How is data going to be used? Privacy is a very, very important issue for us. The cost of creating data, though, as you alluded to, is extremely important to us. Now, I'll say all academic medical centers and large healthcare, say, providers or healthcare institutions share an enormous amount of data with registries, regulators, right? So there's a lot of data sharing that does occur, almost more from a statutory perspective, and then also a credentialing or registry basis as well. But when we start to think about sharing with industry, that's where it does get more complicated. So we do think about the quality of the data that we have, the amount that we've invested in improving that data, and how do we continue to build the quality of the data and invest in the data and invest in our research enterprise if we're giving all of the data away, as you say, for free. We have been doing a fair amount of work looking at different approaches to sharing data. So for example, you may have heard of federated sharing versus literally transferring data to a third party. So in a federated model, you would create almost like a neutral zone where a third party could come into that area. It might reside within, say, in our case, the Mount Sinai firewall in a special area of our information technology systems that are protected, and an entity could run algorithms against it or analytics against it. And I would say versus the idea of literally transferring data to a third party. And when I'm going to kind of circle back to privacy because I think someone mentioned earlier in the presentation, the issue of like very small populations. So we always worry about re-identification, small populations. I think anonymity in terms of de-identification is important. And also not only anonymity of the individual, but of the actual source of data that you can imagine that data on a particular institution could be used inappropriately against that institution if it was all identified just as being from, pick your favorite large clinical provider or academic medical center. And so I've given you quite a few different items that we think about. It's not exhaustive, but those are some of the things that we think about, David.
Okay. And my second question for you, Eric, relates to this idea, and I know this is always a little bit of a sticky one. The idea of when data is, this public databases is becoming a big topic. A lot of public databases are being developed. And the idea of if we give data to a public database, we want to restrict it so that industry will not have access to it. And many academic institutions are saying that will contribute so long as industry cannot have access to it. Other academic centers can use it, whatever, but not industry. And yet at the same time, if industry were to come to that academic institution and say, hey, we would like to contract with you to work, it's a lot easier to do. You know, they'd be much more willing to do it. So I'm just wondering what some of the considerations are there, if you think those are valid thoughts, or, you know, what some of the things that might go into that. What are the real world considerations here?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, you know, some of the real world considerations are literally participation in registries, right? There's many registries, and they play a role in certifying or credentialing programs, and it's necessary to share information with those registries. Now, what we've seen over time is a transition where those registries are moving from having limited rights to use the de-identified data for other purposes to actually including clauses in their contracts that essentially say they can use the de-identified data for any purpose. And that's not in all cases, but that is in some cases. And so, you know, those are situations where as a healthcare provider, you really need to participate in a registry, and you do lose control of the de-identified data in those kinds of situations. You know, those are things that we are concerned about, but we don't have actually there's really no choice but to participate in those kinds of situations. I do think when you think about going through public databases versus coming directly to a holder of the data, the quality of the data that you receive may be very different, right? The quality of the data, fully de-identified data that may be only a slice of data for a particular indication or a particular procedure is very different than getting broader, more longitudinal de-identified data that could be used to do, of course, much more deep analytics, machine learning, or support more advanced approaches or techniques in terms of artificial intelligence. So I think that if you really want to get the most valuable data and actually be able to get data sets that give you the most flexibility in terms of developing new solutions, and ultimately I want to go back to what I said earlier, what's really critical about all of this is it has to be focused on patient benefit. And by the way, I should say that our data use policies for external data use, there has to be a clear link to research, a clear link to a project that we see could benefit patients, that sharing data outside of that framework is not something that we would like to pursue or want to support. So I don't know if I'm answering your question fully, David, but yes, it is difficult to think about freely sharing data with commercial entities that can leverage that data for commercial purposes when the institution has invested millions upon millions of dollars creating the data, creating the systems to manage the data, creating better structures for the data. The amount of effort that's going in, I heard someone mention natural language processing earlier. The amount of effort and resources and money that are going into taking unstructured clinical notes and converting them to actually structured information that could be used in machine learning or AI is enormous. And so when we think about a third party deriving commercial benefit from the data, we really do need to think about a way to somehow feed value back into our research enterprise so that frankly, we can continue to invest and continue to develop better and better data lakes, data sources, databases, et cetera.
Okay, I think we're pretty much out of time. Rowena, were there any burning questions? We only have a minute or two left.
No, but Rick has a comment. I don't know if
Rick Avila?
Yeah,
What was
no,
his-
I was just saying that previous quantitative imaging workshop, we did have a recommendation to set up a global opt-in database that allows patients to share their anonymized data for research or for open research. What do the panelists think about that concept?
I think we're going to take that up in the workshop, Rick. It's a challenging question, so let's leave that till later.
You got it.
Anyway, I want to thank the panelists. This was really a wide-ranging set of questions and expertise, and I think we covered a lot of ground. So much more I'd love to ask questions about and get your thoughts on, but thank you again. And remember by the participants to fill out the forms, the review forms. Thank you all. And for the next session, Chris is taking over.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, David, and good afternoon. I had the pleasure, kind of sitting in, and obviously as we planned the sessions, thinking about how we would do this complementary. And I hope that you would find the second half of this, a good additive to what you've heard earlier today. So as you heard, I'm the co-chair of this session with David, and I'm a thoracic medical oncologist at Dana-Farber, and I'm the Chief Clinical Access and Equity Officer for the Dana-Farber. And most of my focus and over the last 20 years has really been on the health and care of lung cancer patients, both prevention and treatment and diagnosis, and that's been the focus of my clinical and research life, and the major emphasis for my clinical access, equity, and social justice work. So as we think about these conversations about data and thinking about how we were going to use the tools at our disposal to really help empower patients, we thought it was really important to consciously change the focus from our concerns as clinicians, researchers, institutions, and policymakers, and bring it back to participants, patients, and community, with special emphasis on our historically marginalized communities. So we encourage any of the panel members who can to stay for the end for Q&A, because I think we hope to be able to talk a little bit. And the way this is going to work, there'll be roughly 10 to 12 minute talks, 3 of them. One is going to be a framing session by myself, and then you will hear from Shanta Chambers, who is the Executive Vice President of Health Equity Initiatives and Community Engagement for the Patient Advocate Foundation. And then following that, you'll hear from Dr. Samuel Seichert about our intervention. And he is the Professor of Medicine at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, in the Division of Internal Medicine and Clinical Epidemiology, and was founding director for the program on health and clinical informatics. And Dr. Seichert is going to talk about an intervention that was built, with the community involved. And I think it's a good way for us to think about bidirectionality. So with that as a way to get started, let's go ahead and start the recorded talks, and then we'll come back for the Q&A afterwards. Good afternoon. I want to welcome everybody to the second half of our session today. I'm Dr. Christopher Lathan, and I'm a medical oncologist who focuses specifically on lung cancer. I am also the Chief Clinical Access and Equity Officer at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. And today, what we want to do in this session is really set up the conversation for our speakers coming next to really delve a little deeper into the ethics of using big data in medicine. And what I plan to do today in this overview slide is really talk about big data and equity, and that's one of the issues here, and give you some examples. Talk about medical hubris, because I really feel that this is one of the areas that gets us into trouble as we think about using our tools. We get very excited about the use of our technology tools, and we think that the new tools might be able to alleviate some of the other problems. And then the other question is to ask ourselves, how do we protect communities, and think a little bit about prospective community engagement, and some of the ways I think that this can be mediated, which is through transdisciplinary research teams and end with a call to action. So I start here with our enemy here, Joe Camel, in thinking about tobacco and lung cancer. And so certainly all of us who are watching this know, and here for this conference, we know what we're talking about here, about lung cancer screening and underutilization rates and the differential impact based on race and class and region. And I think you're going to see a slide in a minute where the impact of the pandemic, I think, is going to worsen these issues for us in lung cancer screening. And the big question is, can we use technology to level the playing field? Dr. Mulshine always says, he really has an approach of thinking about how we can use the technology to allow people to take back, the control of this and allow people to really advocate for themselves. And I don't want to forget to talk about, the targeting of a historically marginalized community. So yes, for Black and Indigenous, blue collar folks of all races, and also the LGBTQ community with tobacco and tobacco advertising. So we know that specific marginalized communities are being targeted. This slide is really just showing what American Cancer Society is thinking about as far as how the pandemic could be worsening our issues with screening. And certainly the data is still mixed. There are some early studies that are showing that there are issues with screening and screening rates, and that's going to lead to mortality issues. As we know in lung cancer, we are particularly vulnerable here. And so how we utilize our screening modalities, how the screening modalities have been impacted by pandemic is going to make a situation that's already bad much worse. So pivoting to the topic of today, which is really, thinking about applications of AI and big data, I really thought this was an excellent illustrative slide. It's really taken from Dr. Delami's artificial intelligence and big data paper. And I thought it was a good illustration of where we are in healthcare. We know that big data has many applications in medical care. We know that physicians tend to be overly optimistic about the use of technology. If you have a new tool, whether it's a robot surgeon or a new data method, we tend to be very excited about how this can fix the problems of the past. We don't tend to think about unintended consequences in the future. And I think as we think about evidence-based data mining and the combination of patient-reported outcome data and how data mining plus evidence-based data and patient-reported outcomes, how do these all merge together? And I want us to think about that as we continue to move forward into this big data AI algorithm world, not to forget about evidence-based data in the present and also about patient-reported outcome data. And that the historically excluded communities are particularly vulnerable to exploitation with these tools. And I'll get into that in a little more detail. Could they be protected? Well, there's some federal protections. They are a little weak, meaning that they're basically based off the 14th Amendment, and local states can have a lot of say in how individual data and data mechanisms are used. So I put at the bottom here a lot of the references for this, but certainly this is a new frontier. And I think a lot of times we don't really know the proprietary elements of our algorithms. And this is another great illustration. We're really focusing in our lung cancer screening discussion on the diagnostics data area there that I've highlighted in the box. And I bring this up because most AI algorithms tend to be proprietary. And unlike when I do large database analysis, someone can ask me for my code and I can show them what assumptions I've made. Well, what we know is when you're looking at these AI algorithms, we don't always know the assumption. Sometimes that's proprietary and it's not able to be shared. And that really means that we might not be able to see the bias that's built in. So let's just get to that, right? Let's talk a little bit about how structural racism and classism, this is not individual acts. We tend to think of them as individual acts, but the truth is it's really hard to understand how our data is impacted by the structure of our society, especially if you're not impacted by it, right? So while these AI algorithms are helpful, they've been shown sometimes to inadvertently be discriminatory. And I think, when you look at facial recognition software, when you look at vocal recognition, this is well documented in things that people use every day. All right, Chris, well, that's fine, but what about looking at this in governmental arenas and specifically getting into medicine? Well, before we get to medicine, we know that this big data usage and the AI algorithms often being touted as objective have been used to try to rectify currently existing non-egalitarian structures. So insurance, e-scores for loans, IQ personality tests that people do pre-job, and criminal sentencing software, all of these things were done really to try to eliminate bias. But what we have found is that actually, because of the implications and because of the use of the built environment variables that they put in, it unintentionally built in bias to all of these. And it's very hard to get people to admit it and recognize it because, again, you don't have access to the proprietary AI algorithms and be able to understand what the problems are to make adjustments. So historically marginalized communities also have a good reason to question the intention of the medical community regarding the data. Let's be honest here, right? We have a lack of representation in cancer genome data sets. There's been careless stewarding of the data and tissue for marginalized communities. We don't have to get into Henrietta Lacks, Tuskegee. There's a lot of things there that the community knows about that is not in the distant past, but in the recent past. And then, just look at some of the data sets specifically. There's a very Eurocentric focus in germline data sets. An example of my own life, my mother had early onset dementia. And when she passed, many of my medical colleagues asked me, hey, are you going to get a test for that? Turns out that the tests for early dementia are really based off of European subsets, and they're not validated in African Americans. You don't really know that unless you delve deep into the data, but that test is not useful at all for someone like myself or for millions of people who don't come from a very specific background. And so I put the caution at the end of what I call race medicine to remember that race is a social construct, not a biologic construct. And what we're trying to do when we talk about big data is make sure we're dealing with the variables that are appropriate. So lung cancer screening is important. The use of AI might be helpful, but without real efforts to combat bias and acknowledgement of some of the past issues, we will do the same damage. And if you have a moment to read The Weapons of Math Destruction by Kathy O'Neill is a great book. I also put in a couple other books here that I got a lot of the information from. It's a really good, sobering way to think about how these things can impact us. And intent can be separate from impact. You can have good intent and still have an impact that puts people at risk. Okay, so transdisciplinary approaches, I think, are the best way to deal with inequity in big data. And again, we're going to be leading into our two speakers. One is going to be talking about this from the advocacy community, and the other looking at an intervention that utilized EMR and in the community, I think in a way that is really a good example of how to put some of these tools together. So there's some perspective opportunities here. You want to ask these questions as you use your tools, your AI tools and your big data tools. Does the tool increase the agency and self-determination of historically marginalized groups? Is the data representative and relevant to our actual society as it is today? Do the participants have agency? So if you're collecting health information, if you're collecting information that is shepherded, is it shepherded by the community? Is it owned by someone else? And have we engaged with the shepherds of that data and the participants of that data? And was the community engaged from the start if you're building this tool from the ground up? And then consciously think about diverse transdisciplinary teams involved with the building of your research tool. So cross-cutting technical, clinical, translational, basic science, social science, and policy. You really want to focus there. It's the only way to keep us from making the same mistake and getting lost again, right? The only way to make sure you don't get lost again is take a different path. And we must do that. So just want to end last two slides thinking about transdisciplinary research and thinking about it very specifically. Transdisciplinary research is really a mode of collaboration where people are operating outside of their own disciplines. It's not just a bunch of docs getting together, a bunch of engineers getting together. It's really taking social scientists plus an engineer plus a medical doc plus a structural person or a data coder, and really thinking about things outside of their usual intellectual space. And it's hard. It's very, very difficult. And I think if you want to think about how we can protect our communities as we move forward, ask yourself a question. Have you engaged with the communities at the start of your data project? Have you engaged faith-based groups, large employers, community leaders, and policy experts? Do you have the desire to really correct the algorithms and acknowledge the bias? I think if you don't really have the desire to do that, because it's going to be hard, it's going to require forethought and time, then are you really going to protect the community? And build your transdisciplinary team. Ask yourself, is your team inclusive, technical skills, perspective, and is it representative of marginalized communities? Is there voice from people who could be affected by the big data, by the algorithm? And do you really want this authentic transdisciplinary output into your data sets and AI algorithms? I think you should, but if you don't, then it's something that we need to really think about. And I wanted to, this is not easy. It's going to require us to have a little umph and determination and will and spend some resources, right? And there's some great data on this that was published by Gellert and thinking about transdisciplinary challenges and why it's important. I will leave you with the idea that it's not easy, but it is necessary. And so last slide here is my call to action before we get to our speakers. Know that our medical research has often been used knowingly and unknowingly to categorize and subjugate immigrants, poor, and descendants of slaves in the US. That the research has not been agnostic as much as we'd like to think so, and until very, very recently has overtly frowned upon the social justice approach in medicine. And the legacy of this remains today. Big data and AI are the new frontier. Have we remembered any of these lessons from the past? And this picture that you see over there is from 1963, when people were really protesting the AMA stance, which didn't want to desegregate hospitals and move forward with Medicare. So if you haven't already, I recommend folks listen to the 1619 podcast, episode 4, When the Bad Blood Started, about medicine. And I think this is a good way to frame the conversation and our speakers that are coming forward. So thank you very much for your time and your attention.
Afternoon. I'm Shanta Chambers, Executive Vice President, Health Equity Initiatives and Community Engagement, Patient Advocate Foundation. This afternoon, I would like to share with you a few remarks in the context of big data and AI. Think patient first. Minorities have been disproportionately denied loans, mortgages, and credit cards. Unbiased algorithms were supposed to fix that. However, they haven't. It's been well documented that even with the removal of race and gender from algorithm models, it does not close the gap and predict default rates among white, Black, and Hispanic borrowers. One reason is that race tends to correlate with many other characteristics, such as an applicant's neighborhood and other factors. But research has found that eliminating 10 other factors that correlate most with race, such as education level, property type, only slightly reduce the disparity in default rate predictions. Human resources. How can we learn and what can we learn from our human resource environment? So human resource algorithms aren't sophisticated enough to make strategic decisions when it comes to hiring and selecting key personnel. In 2004, Amazon learned this. They launched a new recruitment algorithm to help them find the best job candidates. A year into this experiment, the company saw that the tool was biased against women and quietly shut the program down. And many employers now use AI-driven tools to interview and screen job seekers, many of which pose enormous risk for discrimination against people with disabilities and other protected groups. In our world of big data, it's possible to reconstruct whether someone is part of a protected group, even if you're excluding race and gender. We cannot ignore that for marginalized populations, the healthcare system has been entrenched in discriminatory behaviors and practices that have breed years of mistrust, and some of those behaviors continue today. This entrenched behavior has not only played out in healthcare systems, but also in criminal and legal systems, in housing, in workplaces, and as I'll point out later, other systems. Unbiased algorithms, again, they were supposed to fix this, but they haven't. So what if we begin to turn our focus and look through a lens of equity? As I was preparing my brief remarks for you today, it stimulated more questions than actual answers. Like many of us, when preparing remarks, I went to the World Wide Web to see what other thoughts are on this continuing emerging issue. So what are these questions that we really should begin to ask ourselves? What do we expect from these algorithms? Do we expect them to help to improve the patient's experience, or do we intend for them to help improve related outcomes? Should we be thinking about algorithms in a way that helps to inform decisions? Or should we be thinking about algorithms in a way that ensures equity? We have to also ask ourselves, who's at the table? But furthermore, who's absent from the table in our algorithm design? And then we also should ask ourselves, what else could our algorithms do? And what won't they allow us to do? Although we may be designing algorithms for clinical care, we have to again ask ourselves, who's on this team? Is the team comprised of cross-disciplinary stakeholders, such as those who represent nutrition, social science, mathematics, computer science, or even other disciplines such as law, policy, philosophy, and even those who bring a perspective that accounts not only for the clinical elements of care, but also the social context that influences healthcare outcomes and quality of life. They should then fit these insights into a broader consideration of what is really the strategic trajectory. What is it that we're trying to do? And how might a blind algorithm support or hinder our progress? We have to remember that AI is built by humans for humans. However, oftentimes, the humans intended to be served or benefit from our AI innovation is not always clear. We have to ask ourselves, who will be the greater benefactor of the innovation that AI provides us? Is it our healthcare system? Is it our institutions? Or is it patients? If patients are not the primary benefactors, then our systems will continue to be flawed. Biases in data, we know that, that's no secret. So how do we ensure bias-free data in training or development of algorithm? How do we ensure that the data we're using is inclusive and representative of populations of people who have often been underrepresented, such as people of color, women, or marginalized groups? How do we ensure bias-free processes from design to development to implementation to use? We must acknowledge that our current tech industry had limited representation of people who can understand and can work on these potential harms. How do we ensure that other data systems that help to inform even AI design are bias-free? As Dr. Latham has highlighted, we cannot ignore the historical experiences of data and some of the unintentional harms that have been caused by its use. We also must acknowledge that rather than eliminate discriminatory practices, that in some cases AI has worsened them. So how do we stop ourselves from doing the same things over and over, but expecting different results? So I bring you to this image because I think it's critical for us to understand that everyone is not on board in this whole AI conversation, including patients. You see before you an article that was released by the ACLU in July of 2013 that really points to the concern that there have been situations where actually AI has deepened racial and economic inequities. And as a part of that, really calling our current administration, the Biden administration, to really look at that so that we don't continue to this perpetual cycle of harm. The image that you see focused is at the bottom right, is actually an article that highlights how discharge planning decisions were being informed with help from an AI model. The challenge is that oftentimes patients have no idea that AI is involved in their care. One of the greatest challenges within our healthcare system is the issue of trust. We cannot afford to underestimate the enormity of the historical and present practices that impede trust within the patient-provider relationship. If there are challenges and threats to these relationships in an in-person interaction, we must understand that in a digital platform by which patients have no internal knowledge or understanding only further threaten this whole element of trust. So I want to bring your attention to the patient algorithm, right? So what you see here, these are all of the things that patients are processing. So these are all of the things that patients are filtering when they're thinking about their care. However, our current designs don't account for any of these things that our patients are actually processing. So how do we really begin to do something different? How do we really begin to design systems that account for all of these other factors that patients are processing as they're matriculating along their healthcare journey? I ask you this: is there a role for AI in care delivery? Absolutely. We see the benefits where there have been enormous processes that have been really enhanced and informed by AI. But as I've also pointed out, there are some great challenges that we really have to figure out, how do we resolve? The opportunities before us to reimagine our development process and create room for patients in the development is critical. Allow space for, how do we begin to allow space for co-creation so that we extinguish this perpetual cycle of designing things for patients with the exclusion of patients? Come with me. Reimagine an AI process that engages patients in the design, in the development, in the implementation, and the use. A process that engages patients at every single step. Patients representing diverse racial and ethnic groups, geographic communities, social, economic status, sexual orientations, language, and culture. Reimagine the integration of healthcare technology informed by the lived experience of patients with their healthcare and quality of life goals at the core. Reimagine our design process, putting patients first and co-creating with them, not simply for them. Can this type of co-creation exist? Absolutely. And my fellow panelists is going to demonstrate that it can happen, that it can work, that you can engage with patients and communities in a very strategic way to help inform the integration of big data and AI to bring forth some of the best innovation. Yes, the question is, it can happen. The answer to the question is that it can happen. The challenge is, are we ready to be provocative in our development and expand our table to create more space for others on the team so that we design systems that account for the medical and the social context of care delivery? And more importantly, to design it in a way that we capture the information that is most important to patients. Is there an opportunity before us for AI in healthcare delivery? Absolutely, as long as we continue to keep patients first. Thank you for your time.
Hi, I'm going to talk to you today about a multifaceted intervention designed to attenuate Black-white treatment disparities in cancer. I don't have anything to disclose this morning. Let's look at the problem. Starting in the 1980s, you can see that problems in lung cancer treatment have been demonstrated for curable lung cancer. This happens in a lot of cancers, but we're gonna focus on the lung cancer model. And all these studies are controlled for age, comorbidities, and socioeconomic factors, yet the Black-white disparity still exists. This starts way back to Bach's Sentinel study in 1999, and the last report was Wolf in 2019. In our study, published in JAMA in 2010, if you consider the tissue-confirmed cases of curable lung cancer only, you can see that the data almost perfectly mimic that of Bach in his Sentinel study in '99. We did our study prospectively, and what we discovered is that Black patients with 2 or more significant comorbid illnesses almost never went to surgery, whereas white patients still did. And so this suggests implicit bias in decision-making in gray areas. Also, Black patients who perceive poor communication with white physicians were much less apt to go to surgery. And finally, in this time of denial and anger and shock, Black patients who did not have a regular source of primary care often disappeared before adequate diagnosis and treatment took place. What are the solutions to all this? Well, we decided to have a discussion with the affected community. The Greensboro Health Disparities Collaborative was formed in 2003 at the behest of the community after the Institute of Medicine report on unequal treatment. And what the community analysis showed is that this isn't the problem of bad apples, this is a system problem. And their conclusion was that transparency in real time could conceivably affect treatment completion. Obviously, in all the administrative data studies that have been shown, 5-year-old data, the cat's out of the barn, and that's not going to affect treatment now. The other thing they suggested was accountability, that the cancer care teams needed to know, again, in real time, how they were doing with Black patients and how they were doing with white patients. And the third concept that they came up with was enhanced communication. And by that, they mean not just using more understandable language so people understand what's really going on, but the communication has to involve engagement and re-engagement. It just can't be a one-time deal. Well, what we did is we took these concepts and tried to operationalize them in cancer centers, and the results of that were published in Cancer Medicine in 2019. 5 cancer centers participated, and I want to point out specifically the University of Pittsburgh Hillman Cancer Center. And in all our studies, we try and use at least 1 or 2 cancer centers from the north, so people don't say that this is just a southern thing. And as far as eligible early stage lung cancer patients go, we included almost everyone. So this really was a pragmatic study. And how did we translate the interventions into cancer center use? First of all, we created a real-time warning system. Since the HITECH Act in 2010, almost all cancer centers have electronic health records, and so there are digital data everywhere. And in this real-time warning system, what we programmed in is that a warning would come up if a patient missed an appointment, and if that happened, a navigator would engage and re-engage the patient and overcome the barriers to bring them back into care. But the other thing I showed you earlier is there is such a thing as clinical inertia in cancer care. And so we talked to clinicians and we programmed in anticipated milestones in diagnosis and treatment of lung cancer care. And so if a patient was keeping their appointments and one of these milestones were not met, a warning would come up, and the navigator or a physician champion would engage the clinical team and ask, do you really mean for this to happen? For accountability, we use classic quality improvement, audit, and feedback to the clinical teams, and we did it according to race. So again, they knew how their white patients were doing with treatment completion and how their Black patients were doing, and they were able to understand when there was a gap there. And the third part of the intervention was a specially trained navigator who was proactive in engaging these lung cancer patients. And this navigator was trained in particular barriers that affect the Black community, and they also underwent anti-racism training from the Racial Equity Institute. And again, these navigators would communicate to patients in a serial, proactive manner. In terms of the analysis, we had a retrospective control group, and even though these data haven't changed in 30 years, we had a concurrent control group so no one would criticize us for leaving out any secular trends. And so we did within intervention group comparisons, and we also did between group comparisons between the intervention and the retrospective and concurrent groups. The results, well, first, the within group comparison for the retrospective group. And what I want to point out here is we use stereotactic radiation as equivalent to lung cancer surgery. So even with that caveat, there was a 9% difference in the raw data in completed treatment for white patients compared to Black patients. In a multivariate analysis that again was done using age, comorbidity, cancer stage, gender, and socioeconomic factors, the odds ratio for a Black patient to receive full treatment was 0.66, and this was statistically significant. When we did the within intervention group comparison, with the intervention, treatment was almost perfect, 95.1% for white patients and 96.5% for Black patients. And in the multivariate analysis, there was no statistical difference. With the between group comparison, we used the white retrospective group as the referent group, as that was the best treatment before the intervention. And as you can see, we confirmed the 0.66 odd ratio for the Black retrospective group, but the Black intervention group and the white intervention group both got statistically and clinically and much better treatment completion than the white retrospective group. So this multifaceted intervention helped everyone. And when we did the concurrent group comparison in the multivariate analysis, both the Black intervention group and the white intervention group got better care, better treatment completion. I only picture the odds ratio for the Black intervention group here. So what does this all mean? To remedy systematic institutional level racism, number one, you should work with affected communities to determine the appropriate barriers to conquer and the appropriate outcome measures. Number two, you must measure outcomes according to race or other disadvantaged group. Number three, apply the interventions in real time, and they need to include transparency, accountability, and excellent communication that is both clear and serial in nature. And as good quality improvement folks do, you need to measure again, iterate, and measure again, and make sure you get it right. Well, this conference section has to do with artificial intelligence. How does that fit into all this? Well, the question arises, who do you put into this real-time registry? If you only use the patients who show up at multidisciplinary thoracic oncology conference, then you're missing a great deal of the population that could be effective. So what about figuring out the abnormal CTs and the ED and with screening CTs? Well, the number of abnormalities would be overwhelming. So how do we combine specific CT findings with specific exposures in the community and geocoding to maybe come up with a system that identifies the most likely patients to turn out to have cancer to put into the registry? The second way that AI could be used is identifying patients that are most likely to benefit from comprehensive, proactive, racially sensitive navigation so you can hire the right amount of people. And then finally, fine-tuning the gray areas of comorbid illness to really understand who would be at the most risk for these treatments. So this intervention overcomes some of the racial barriers in the medical system, and it's a systematic intervention that overcomes some of the social determinants of health. Still, we need to consider the physiology of the experience of racism and cortisol dysfunction and epigenetics but that's a talk for another day. Thanks for your attention.
Fantastic. I want to say once again, thank you to Shanta. Thank you, Sam, for those talks. And I'm going to open it up a little bit. We're going to focus, on, we have some questions, and certainly please send questions in the Q&A session. And so we will take some of those. I have a couple to start it off, and I know that some of us have a hard stop at 4:30. So I'm going to jump in, and then we'll take the questions as we need. So I'm going to ask this question to both our panelists. And what I really want to ask you a little bit about is, is there a role here? First of all, how do we get researchers and other entities to acknowledge the diversity across disciplines? So how do we do that? And Sam, I know you built an intervention there, and maybe you can talk a little bit about, what went into talking to communities, and Shanta also talking about some of the things that you've seen, that ways that people can build their data sets. And I know there's a lot of talk about AI, but I'm talking about building your registry data too, because that's what's going to go into your intervention set. So how do we get people to acknowledge the diversities across disciplines at the beginning, and maybe a little insight to what you see that might have worked? So maybe we'll start with Shanta and then go to Sam.
So Chris, I think, for years, we've always talked about this phenomenal concept of multi-disciplinary team-based healthcare and all of those things. And I think now, if at no other time in history, we have a perfect and unique opportunity to operationalize that concept, because we have to understand that we know people don't exist in a vacuum. They don't exist in a box. And what they experience and how they exist within the four walls of the healthcare system is almost like a perfect case study, right? Because they have every single thing around them that they will ever need to be able to adhere to whatever treatment recommendation they have. They're not worried about utilities. They're not worried about food. They're not worried about water. They're not worried about any of those things. However, at discharge planning, the anxiety of all of those realities now begin to manifest. And so that's why I use the example, in that example, it was the use of AI in discharge planning. Well, AI in discharge planning doesn't allow room for that social worker, that nutritionist, that other person on the team who may be able to uncover some of the challenges that individual will now experience in terms of adhering to treatment recommendations once they return home. And so I think it is a great opportunity for us to really think about, how do we take this team-based approach to care that allows us to bring in all of the other disciplines that are so critical to healthcare. There is a role for the social worker, the nutritionist, the financial navigator. It's a role for all of them, and in terms of healthcare delivery, healthcare access. And as we talk about our marginalized populations, that allows us to also look at things through an equity lens, because it forces us to not assume that everyone is starting from the same place, but it forces us to ask those critical questions to bring very tangible solutions to those things that are reflective in patient A's life. You can't do that with AI because it's not accounting for patient A, because it's assuming that everyone's a patient A or patient B or patient C. So it's not sophisticated enough to do some of that motivational interviewing, some of that motivational inquiry that is needed to really help to understand a patient, not only in the context of medical care in the four walls, but also the social context of their care outside of the four walls.
Yeah, and the main function of this big informatics system, and by the way, we dealt with, in this study, we did 5 different electronic health record vendors. In our chronic disease study, Heart Health Now, we did over 20. You talk about trying to harmonize data and the need for antacids, and thinking that I might be in an orange jumpsuit because I can't get it done. But anyway, putting informatics difficulties aside, how many times have you seen a computer actually change someone's behavior who wasn't engaged? This warning system, if it comes up, and Shanta's point about people starting at different places. And that goes with for clinicians too. You know, if the clinician, if there's kind of inertia, a barrier in decision making, you need to be able to communicate to basically move things forward. And the same holds true for patients, especially a patient who's gone through a life of discrimination and mistrust and stereotypes. How are you going to build up that trust to move forward? The computer's not going to do it. So everything we build that uses AI or not needs to keep in mind that that human interaction is what makes it go. There has to be a human extension of the technology. And in terms of the community, one thing I forgot to mention in the talk is the community actually designed our navigation protocols too. And the way that our research staff communicated with patients. And so the community had a huge role in the success of this work. And really, right now at the Lineberger Cancer Center at UNC, we have started a Lineberger Equity Council, and one of the tasks of the council is to create protocols for doing research with an equity lens, acknowledging much of what Shanta said in her presentation.
Fantastic. I want to do, so I'm going to ask a question that came up on the Q&A, but I'm going to kind of link it in with a question I was going to ask, because I was going to start to ask you guys about bidirectionality conversations and listening to communities. I think that's hard for us as institutions and academics to sit and listen. And the question is, you know, it says, could you address the topic of religiosity and fatalism? Some people talk about this as a locus of control issue. You know, not to mince words, but locus of control, it's different from fatalism, right? You're really thinking about the activities beyond you are in control, as opposed to many people thinking about having an internal locus of control instead of an external locus of control, where, you know, this happened, good things happen to me because I made them happen, as opposed to good things happen to me because it happens. And, you know, you're vulnerable to that, less money you have and less education you have. And so, and the rest of the question is there a factor, is this a factor for some of the differences? I assume you're talking about the disparities. And in my patient population, this has emerged. It seems rather challenging. So I'm gonna open this up a little bit to both Sam and Shanta. And I think personally, this kind of listening and engaging with your community, whether they're a faith-based community or not, can help with some of this. We've seen this in COVID, but let's hear what both of you guys think. Either of you can start, by the way.
Well, in the 2010 JAMA study that I alluded to, we did find that religiosity was a factor in the Black community not accepting treatment. And again, in working with our community partners, I mean, they were all in on this idea. Again, it comes up with the enhanced communication and the idea that that God uses healthcare and healthcare workers as a tool to help patients, and kind of flipping that belief that it's not faith alone that cures disease, but it's God's use of individuals, and part of that communication is, again, how do the caregivers, how do the providers communicate? Because if you go into this, if you love your patients, that's going to come across, right? And so the humanism of medicine is an important factor there. And if you're talking to patients about their families and how their situations at home is going, and not just being clinical all the time, I mean, that's part of that same sort of milieu of communication that's effective. And again, it's not just a Black community thing. We saw it work really in all communities in our study.
And I'll just underscore, we have to understand the role of religions from a race, ethnic, and cultural positioning, right? So you have to understand that specifically for Black and African Americans, in some of the worst times in history, their faith was the one thing that they felt was enduring. It was trusted. It was the foundation. It is where they drew their strength. And so you have to understand when they trust nothing else, that is, or no one else, it is their faith, it is their belief. That's the one thing that they really can remain true to, and it's very trusting. So I think we have to understand it from the cultural perspective. And so I think that as we talk about the role of cultural humility, and I prefer humility versus competence, because I don't think any of us will ever be fully competent in another person's culture. So cultural humility, so having an understanding of the role, the historical role that religion has played compared to the historical experience of person of color with medicine. And they are that's like oil and water. It doesn't automatically mix. So you have to understand the context. And then once you understand the context, as Sam pointed out, then how do you adapt as a professional, as a healthcare provider in your engagement? Because now you understand the role of religion and faith in all of that. And if you don't, then reach out to those faith-based communities and say, help me understand the context of this and the health and the well-being of my patients. Because as I approach whole person care, I realize that this is something very personal and very critical to the patients I'm serving. And I want to be the best provider to them. And the way that I do that is understand this as a part of their care delivery.
Well said. I think, and again, the only other thing I'll add to that is I think when this happens, how you ask and talk to communities, if you go in and you're having, so I'll give an example. We have an intervention in federally qualified health centers in Boston, and we have a great relationship with both our Spanish-speaking faith-based communities and our traditional African-American, and I say that specifically this way, descendants of slaves in the US, faith-based communities. But we have many people from the African diaspora that are there, and they have a different approach. And we realize that our approaches that was good for Black folks was not actually getting to other specific enclaves. And I think this is one of those things where you have to look at your community, tailor your message, and then go find who the community leaders are, the faith-based leaders, and have not just a conversation where you talk one way, listen, hear, and then what happens, and you will see this in not just us, any folks who've been out and do this work, when the community leaders hear what's going on, they help you figure out, how to really communicate this, and you'll find that communities will build with you. And this is a good pivot. I would like to invite any of the other panelists. I'm going to open it up a little bit because I know we just have about 8 minutes, and I want to ask a general question because I want to get to granular data. I want to get to, talking about how do we make sure we get, all of the stuff that we need, because you heard Shanta say this, you heard Sam say this, we come in with a certain thought process in this as we build these data sets. And one, how do we build trust with our communities? How do we talk to them before we start putting together? And two, what data do we need to bring out that people could bring to it? So nativity is often not in there because, Black is not Black, right? It depends where you're coming from. We know this for people who are Spanish speaking and Latinx communities, big differences. And East Asian communities, if we're lucky to get the data, we say, okay, we're good. And we'll put our logistic regression model together. We put it together and we get our outcomes and we're like, great. But the truth is, where are you from? Where are your parents from? Where have you been? What's your native language? That's the other thing. So I just wanted to, and the data folks, and as we think about putting data sets together, having conversations with community about data and entering the data into our data sets, just give me thoughts about what you have seen has worked, where your struggles are, and again, it just open it in general. I'd like to hear thoughts, from folks in general, because this is where we want to get to. No matter what our technology is, we want to get to a conversation. So I'd like to open up to anybody. So I'm not going to pick on anybody, but anybody wants to share, please do.
Just one quick comment on that, though, going back to Disraeli, lies, damn lies, and statistics. You can take data to the community and you can ask them about their perception of the truth when it comes to data, which is really, put it this way, with the Greensboro Health Disparities Collaborative, they've taught me a lot more than I've taught them.
Absolutely. So anybody else, because we will talk for the next, 6 minutes and take up the time. So I want to make sure anybody else wants to get in there and have some thoughts or observations.
Chris?
Yeah.
This is Jim Mulshine. How you doing? I appreciate the panel's wonderful, and I'm very impressed with the issues that have been raised. When I'm a kind of interested in prevention across the board, and we've been seeing with certain circumstances in colon cancer screening that younger African Americans are being afflicted with this disease at a different age than others potentially. And I will tell you from looking at the lung cancer screening data for women and for African Americans, there seems to be disparities in how the disease manifests itself in these populations. And I'm concerned that there's, a suggestion, I don't know how to phrase this exactly, but there might be greater vulnerability to the tobacco exposure or to whatever drives colon cancer in African American communities. And the recommendations now are based on overall populations, not specifically within the African American community. And to me, this is a big problem because young people dying of late stage cancer when potentially we could have found it and cured it and intercepted that. I mean, that's what screening is all about. And so what are the panelists' thoughts in terms of those types of considerations?
So I'll start, and I really appreciate you raising that because honestly, that could probably be applicable across the entire oncology continuum, right? Even if we look at breast cancer and where we currently start screening, especially women for breast cancer. But I think it is oftentimes our conversation around clinical trials are always really focused on clinical innovation and bringing new therapies to market. It has been a long time since I've seen a trial that looks at, let's look at our screening guidelines and maybe see if we might need to do some reconsideration around when we actually are recommending screenings for A, B, C, and D. And so we don't tend to see that. And we have to acknowledge that though even our screening guidelines, if we always talk about how our therapies that we bring to market are really based upon a predominantly European population, then the same is going to hold true for our screening guidelines. So at what point do we say, wait a minute, we might need to scale this back a little bit and start looking at our screening guidelines and a diversity of the composition of those that we made these recommendations based on. And we know that that diversity does not exist. So how do we do something different so that we don't keep getting the same results?
Yeah, and the same things happen with lung cancer screening. Who dies the most of lung cancer? Well, it's the death rate in Black men is 30% higher than anybody else. And yet it's Black men who don't get screened. And when you take a deep dive into the Southern community data that Vanderbilt publishes, you see that Black men tend to get lung cancer at ages before the screening guidelines suggest. Now, the latest screening guidelines are a little bit better, but it still doesn't acknowledge the degree of tobacco exposure and the ages that affect Black men. And so what it says is, back to research with an equity lens, we have to do it in a way where we get the power in diverse communities to know what the hell we're doing.
And also keeping in mind that none of our screening guidelines ever took into account the social determinants of health. None of them. So those social determinants are those other financial factors that hinder one's ability even to access screening where they are based upon our current guidelines. So we're not looking at the economic state of someone, then they may not even have access. So we have to rethink the way that we do prevention and early detection across the entire continuum. We sat these social determinants over in a box, and then COVID, the tornado came, and now it's like, oh crap, everyone's talking about social determinants. But these have been these upstream factors that have been permeating our society since society existed.
This is fantastic. I thought, Linda, you might wanted to jump in there. So I saw you kind of come to the mute and come back. So I want to give you a moment to respond, and then we're going to pass it off again to David for some wrap up. But I wanted to make sure you got a chance to say something.
Oh, I just was going to concur with what you've been saying, and I firmly agree that these social determinants are incredibly important, and religiosity. I've in fact brought in a postdoc to my team who's an expert in health behavior, because I think that's important when we think about lung cancer screening. Try to address mistrust, all of those factors. It can't be done in a vacuum without the.
No, and just to kind of, first I want to thank all my, my panel, my part of the panel, and certainly, the whole panel. I know there's a lot of great conversation, and we hope this was complimentary. The last thing I wanted to add is granular data is going to be helpful. If you can tailor your messages specifically based on your own community. And if you look at prostate cancer, we don't like to do this in public health. We like to have one clean message, but we know Black men get, PSA, don't screen everybody. What about Black men? Well, they can figure that out. I think if you look at our message on melanoma, Black people get a different, dark-skinned people get a different type of melanoma. And I remember asking this question, and they're like, yeah, it's too complicated to say that dark-skinned folks get melanoma on non-sun exposed areas. So make sure you put your sunscreen on, and which is great, but what about the melanoma that we get? It's kind of complicated. Well, it's complicated for the white folks. So I think we really need to think about how we do that. And that brings us back to this, how we, garbage in, garbage out in our big data. So thank you very much. I want to make sure that I let David sum things up. And I want to say thank you to all of our speakers. And I hope we contributed to the discussion as well.
Well, thank you, Chris. That was a wonderful discussion. I was going to say that, one of the dreams here coming out of this meeting, and I think it's Jim's dream also, is to see these large databases be built. And, and when we're talking about all the things we're going to be looking for, whether it's liver density, muscle mass, developing normograms for what different and these are the kind of things that we want to do. We're going to need input for how to collect the right data so we can do all of the things that we're talking about, these health checks. This is the dream of this meeting, to kind of come up with a way of doing a health check. And to make that valuable, it's got to, cross different populations and bring everybody in. And I think we have this wonderful opportunity to do this. So I thought this session was wonderful. I think the two sessions really were complementary. And I thank all of the panelists for their participation. And fill out your forms for the evaluations. And I think we'll wrap it up there. Hello. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the clinical breakout session. Do we have any people here? Let's see. What do we have? Panelists, attendees, 20? That's wonderful. I can't hear myself speaking. Am I coming through? It's okay. Okay, great. So the title of this session is Data Use in the Time of Screening and AI, Defining Consensus, Value, Context, and Responsibilities. So we have, I guess, an hour. I don't know if we're gonna need the whole hour, but or maybe we will. I wanted to think of this session in terms of if we were to build a database, a big database for that would be of great value for the lung cancer screening world community. Some of the components that we would think would be necessary for that, and many of the sessions today kind of relate to that. So I'm hoping people's voices are in. Jim, do you have any thoughts about before we start? Should people introduce themselves or anything like that, or just go forward? Well, Rowena is on the line. Rowena is taking notes and will be helping to prepare slides for tomorrow's presentation. So to start it off, then I had written up a few questions, and we're going to try to get feedback from the audience. I'm not sure. Does it work where they're going to be able to speak, or is each person able to talk, or are they going to send in comments? I'm sorry, I don't recall how that was going to work. Well, if you can speak, yeah.
David, this is Liz. Yes, they can raise their hand in the feature there, and they'll be given the ability to talk live.
Okay.
Or they can send in questions in the chat below.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thanks, Liz. So let's just talk, sort of the dream of building this database. And I think some of the things that came up today in the conversation, I think were wonderful. Just from that opening, I don't know if those of you who were at the keynote talk, you could just see the potential value of this database where Catherine brought out, wouldn't it be wonderful, Catherine Schmitz brought out how wonderful it would be if we had a nomogram for muscle mass or that we could start thinking about. And all of this could be obtained from CT scans. We could start defining states of health for people. And I think, that's just, one of probably a dozen examples that we could come up with for the value of this and the directions this could go. And you can imagine then thinking about normal values for different populations. So all of what we talked about today feed into this whole kind of combined concept. So I had written down a few questions that I was sort of thinking maybe we'd get some feedback from the audience for. And the first question was, what do we envision using big data for currently? And everything from lung cancer detection to general health. Is there something that we should focus on when you're thinking about the database? Should we be thinking, if we were dreaming of putting together a database for use in advancing lung cancer screening, should we be thinking about it in terms of lung cancer screening, or should we be thinking about this in terms of, all of the other possibilities that we're doing, which is cardiac disease, emphysema? I kind of think the answer to that is pretty obvious, in that we may as well make it as broad as possible, because I think, for all I know, the biggest value that'll come out of lung cancer screening may be, the idea that this is just going to become a general health evaluation. That's sort of my personal view on it, but just some thoughts if we're building this kind of a database. Anybody have any comments?
I think your question about how wide brush should we use in painting this big database as a forerunner that can potentially help that with that. And that is in the ILCAP, you have kind of tried to keep a lot of data on the people that have been participating in your screening research activities. You've now published, I think, over 300 articles using that database. And it may be worth some scrutiny of what you did there and what the yield was there relative to, advice going forward in terms of how to put together this new assemblage of information.
Well, certainly ILCAP is one example of how we collected a multinational, multi-center database, and to an extent, I just as an aside comment, in the early years, most of what we wrote about was lung cancer screening related. As the years went by, Claudia, you're here. But if you looked at the distribution of papers as time went on, I suspect it started shifting more towards other things rather than size of the nodules, detection of nodules. We got into more and more secondary or tertiary, whatever. They may be more important, but most of the publications probably revolved around other things. Yeah. I don't know if any, I guess they do hear you for this, right? Let me ask another question. Assuming the infrastructure exists for supporting the data, curating, monitoring, and releasing it, what are the challenges in using it and putting it together? I think this is a really important question. There's a lot of data out there, and how do we get it, and how do we release it? And I think this is the kind of thing where, I don't know if Heather's on this call. I hope she is, because we've been giving a lot of thought to this. LCAP did it in a particular way. We had everybody under an IRB, and all the patients from all of our 80 outside sites signed informed consents for each patient. But if we were to put together a larger database now and really start collecting resources from, throughout the United States, considering, different populations that we want to make sure are represented, how do we get this data? Heather, are you on? No, she had planned on staying initially. I thought she was staying for this call.
No, she's not on.
Oh, okay. He's on the line now. So, Chuck, we're listening. If you're there, I don't think he's on this call. I'm pretty sure he'd be in the other call, Jim.
I think Chuck is here.
Okay. Well, I'll wait a few seconds and.
Jim's mic is off.
Okay. Well, to me, this is one of the critical questions. And, I have spoken, for example, with Mary Ellen Geiger about how Midrick is doing this. And, they are they try to seek out institutions that have different populations so that they can get representative groups. But what's really been concerning me is, every institution sort of has their own policy. There's no sort of uniform way of collecting data. And each institution or each group you go to has a sort of a different policy for how they'll share the data and what restrictions they want to put on the data. And it kind of becomes a mishmash. And I was, I think we'll follow this. I think perhaps one of the things to do is from this meeting is at least bring this point up as something that's of interest. And how do we reach out to all these sites? I mean, there are hundreds of sites now that are screening, and there's some wonderful, collections of data. How do we get our hands on that if we wanted to put something together? Midrick has made us a data use agreement template that they send, and sites agree to it. They modify it. They put restrictions on who can use the data. And I think that's something that if we were to try to build a big database to start exploring all of the areas we can have an impact in, we'd want to sort of be as open as possible. I guess that's the thing that I'm thinking of, and what are some of the challenges with developing that? So that is something we can follow up on.
Anita works with the Framework of Excellence institutions. And, I think you're up to 900 institutions that are following screening populations.
Is that all?
And Anita may have some thoughts.
It's a good number. I thought you're over 1,000, Anita.
You'll have to repeat the question. We do have a sizable amount of screenings within our program of our Centers of Excellence. I think it's over 800. I don't know if we're quite up to 900. And then we have around 50 of our continuum of care centers too, combined with.
Do you have a sense of what's in those sites beyond number of cases? What other things do you sort of track? Or do you track anything in the sites?
Angela Criswell is our director of that program. So she's going to have more data. We collect information from the screening centers programs that, so they'll complete an annual survey, but that's on an optional or volunteer basis.
Yeah.
So we are tracking and monitoring, and I know that they published a paper, Angela, and it was co-authored by a couple other staff too, regarding their findings through that survey process.
Well, I mean, the go-to centers of excellence and all of the sites that are enrolled, that's just a spectacular resource. If there's a dream of putting something like this together, and I've spoken actually with Lori about this before, the idea, and she's very interested in continuing the discussions, because how do we really leverage this to make something spectacular happen? Places are collecting data. You have 900 sites. You have to have hospitals, that are really representative of all the different communities, and to pull those in a thoughtful way so you get all the different populations. And we start, thinking about what's the most critical information to obtain beyond just the images, that sort of things. And I think the idea of pulling together one of these massive databases where we could do, I think, something kind of transformative. Jim mentions, what we did with LCAP. We have a database of over 250,000 scans in our database. And we're really only now starting to see the value where others are starting to use it and work with it. And I think there are just so many new questions that are coming up that people are going to want to try to answer. And I think that going forward, the idea of building databases that have millions of participants in it. Yeah. There was an LCAP meeting about 10 years ago where we had somebody who's this is before this AI explosion started. And he said, you guys are talking about databases of a few thousand. And we thought, this is great. We have 10,000 or 20,000. He was saying, no, for AI, real AI, you need hundreds of thousands, millions of cases to really do it well. I thought he was nuts.
Yeah.
I thought this was insanity. I don't think it's insane anymore.
No, but one of the other places that I think is a really fertile potential site for such sustained contribution is the VAs. And I think we have a gentleman who is involved in the VA software development who's in the audience that may want to comment on the relevance of looking to the VA to be a source of information from their informatics they're putting together with their imaging. Drew.
Is Drew on the line?
Yeah.
So we'd be delighted. We'd be delighted to hear from Drew.
Let me ask a question. Part of the big hurdle with large databases like this, not so much the scans, it's the clinical information that goes with those scans.
Right.
And so when you say you have 30,000 scans, how many of those have histories, physicals, diagnostic workup, lab results, things of that nature?
Yeah, so you're talking, so for the LCAP database, we were very fortunate that Claudia had the idea early on of really collecting very detailed clinical history, annotating it. And so it's really very comprehensive.
That makes a difference.
Yeah. And we tried to introduce that into the VA also with the VA PALS LCAP system. And at least the sites are going to be used, the sites within VA that are going to be using it are going to be collecting almost identical data. So it would be very useful in that regard.
So we have the data dictionary, maybe the most important part of the VA PALS.
I'd like to raise a population health perspective on a database, and one of the very best population health sources for cancer is the SEER Medicare data, which links all of the Medicare beneficiaries in fee-for-service who show up in SEER. And this is beyond clinical data. Linking to Medicare research identifiable files means you have 9-digit zip codes. You've got race, ethnicity. You've got where the person lived each year they've been in Medicare. You have all of the drugs they've taken since joining Medicare, all of the office visits, diagnosis codes, procedures, lab tests. So this is, and then you can match people who have a procedure to people who haven't had the image.
But I thought they were saying they had many missing.
So that's a different sort of maybe a step too far, but
no, I think that's a wonderful idea. The idea that we were linking, if we were to build this huge imaging database and link it, really have the links to Medicare, that's fantastic.
Or commercial insurers. Obviously, there's more commercial insurers than Medicare, but that kind of density allows a much richer longitudinal view. Someone might have started screening 2 years ago, but you can get all their history for the last 10 years from the administrative data. Not likely to ever get that from electronic medical records in any of our lifetimes.
How far behind is Medicare when you're collecting data?
Currently, I'm working with 2020 data.
So it's within a year. Year or 2 years.
Medicare Advantage encounter data has somewhat bigger lag, maybe a year longer. So you could get Medicare Advantage, you could get Medicare fee-for-service.
Yeah.
So,
David?
Yeah, Drew.
Sorry, my picture isn't displaying here. So Bruce, I really appreciate what you're saying. One of the things that is not very difficult in VA is to, I guess, crowdsource tens of thousands of
Oh, we're waiting
LDCTs.
for him to ask another
So
question.
not only do we have the routers to pull all these DICOMs, we have hard drives and centers of innovation where these can be stored. So your proposal then to pull, standard health service research measures, as you know, is centrally stored within the VA's corporate data warehouse. And I was curious, did you ever get through to anyone to maybe start working with us in VA? I know that our VA PALS team in Nashville was happy to help kind of chaperone you in, since one of our teams actually has one of the deputy directors that manages the VA corporate data warehouse.
I would defer to Claudia on that and answering that on the connection to the VA. Drew was mentioning the VA database capabilities along the lines of the question David asked him, and my comment about a population health metric. So all of that is that I forget the name of the VA database. Vinci, yeah.
But each VA is in charge of its own.
Are you speaking to Drew? I think you need to turn on your microphone, Claudia.
Closer to this, Claudia.
So, Drew, can you hear me?
Claudia, yes.
Okay. So, I mean, the way I understand it, but Drew, you probably have better knowledge. Each VA owns its data, but it sends data to the corporate data warehouse. And certain of that data is collected in Vinci in Salt Lake City. And that's accessible under the correct, you have to get all the correct authorities in order to use it. But so that's from all of the VAs. Or you can ask for IRBs. So for example, San Maguayo has an IRB to collect data and to do research on the screening. So you can have individual IRBs or.
So I think that this string started a while ago where David was identifying the VA as an ideal spot for a population health kind of approach, and Drew picked that up saying, yeah, this is classical health services research tagged with images.
Well, the VA in particular has an advantage that they have the Million Veterans program, so they potentially can link databases of not only images, but link that potentially with all of the other information that's available. The thing about the VA, and Drew, it would be, what we're talking about here is potentially building a large database and making it available to whoever wants to use it, including industry, for example. So that kind of like what's happening now with the NLST data, only a bit more comprehensive and more up to date. You know, NLST just changed their policy. There was an announcement, I just saw it the other day, where it used to be that if you wanted to use the NLST data, you had to apply, you had to submit your proposal, they had to send you back an approval, you had to get IRB approval. Now it is just open. It's open for anyone. So they've really publicly released it. You know, the type of database we're dreaming of, I think there's a lot of considerations there, you know, as to whether or not we'd be able to do that. But can you imagine the VA in any way participating in a program like that, where we get, say, you know, 300 framework sites to participate, you know, take the LCAP data, take, you know, whatever, you know, and have, you know, X number of VA sites participating. Is that something that's even, you know, dreamable about?
Yeah, it's definitely possible. And so I guess, Bruce, maybe I wasn't clear with my question. So when I say our VA PALS team, I am referring specifically to Claudia et al. She's a co-PI of VA PALS. And there was kind of a little birdie that was informing me that a prior Undersecretary of Health had nominated you to come in and help. And I guess I was just waiting for you also to show up, but that never happened. So again, the resources, the technology, the will, the interest is all there. And there's no reason why we couldn't have a data set with 200, 300,000 LDCT scans and then a large kind of corporate data warehouse repository of procedures and also other measures to look at outcomes.
Yeah.
I haven't received the invitation. Maybe
Oh, so
Claudia
you were not
has.
aware of this?
No.
I don't think so.
A very
So-
high-ranking official in the VA pinged me a while back if I knew you, and I gave the most resounding endorsement I could. Let me follow up a second time on this, because we would love to have you officially anointed by the VA secretary or undersecretary to come in and help.
Oh, I'd love to help. I did step out of the room about an hour ago, so that maybe I
This was
missed
not
it.
today.
Administration.
Oh, yeah. Sick Bruce on the military. That's a perfect thought. That's okay. But that's really interesting, Drew, the idea that there could be some kind of collaboration, or, where the VA and other major organizations could contribute data into a common database. Wow. That's pretty spectacular, actually. Let's see. The question of who would have access, you heard that in the session that I chaired. This is a very interesting issue. And Heather had brought up the ideas of patients' concerns about where the data is being used and how that's being handled. Sometimes institutions have concerns where they just say, you can use it for anything except industry. Industry can't have it. Other institutions are saying, whoever wants it, take it. And so I think that's the kind of thing that we would like to come up with, as broad a policy as we can, because ultimately, I think the major breakthroughs come in from industry. When they have access to data, they really can make things happen. And even, I'm not talking just big industry, I'm talking about the startup companies. Imagine how this would be a driver to get startup companies moving. They spend all their time trying to raise the funds to get, an image database. If they had this available to them, it would accelerate, in so many ways. So I think that's one of the more exciting possibilities of us doing this. And this is one of the dreams of MIDRIC that Mary Ellen is hosting. And I guess the question is there a role for other organizations to do this, or?
I just want to sort of, nobody understands how much data cleaning needs to be done on those and how time consuming that is. And that's what I spent the last 20 years doing for each and every paper and for each and every entry. So that has to be really factored in for them to be valuable.
Yeah, and I guess that is one of the main topics also, which I kind of was going to allude to. What's the most important thing to get? Is it the images? Is it the metadata? Is it the annotated images? What is it that really will, move things forward? Emanuela talked a little bit about the idea of a database that continually evolves, and you're continuing to collect data, which is ideal because in that way you're keeping up with technology. So you get a database that constantly collects data, and then theoretically you could constantly be doing things like updating normal values. But Claudia, is very good at reminding us about how much data cleaning needs to be done before you can really start doing things of value. So it's really this tremendous balance. On the other hand, Claudia, you know, the more careful you are on collecting it, the less cleaning you have to do.
Right. Then, I mean, then you have to put all your money up front and check on everything. But so we've evolved. So for example, we didn't have the bottom mass index. And so then the problem is that you always have missing data for some of the key things, but at least we can use statistical techniques for missing data. But you do need to be updating both what you collect and how you collect.
Okay. Any thoughts about how this could be done? Who would do it? Separate organization? Should this be something that's done through NIH? Should this be done outside of NIH? Should we ask some of the other organizations to put together a consortium and partner up in putting together a major initiative to do this? It's just some of the things that I've been thinking about. You know, Prevent Cancer, Go-To Foundation. You know, they're already kind of involved in all of these things, and it seems that it's a logical extension that would dramatically accelerate the field. I think would be nothing like this.
To Claudia's point, you got to figure out how many dollars it's going to take to do that. That's who's going to determine who can support it and who can't.
Yeah. Well, the good thing is, you know, I used to talk, for example, to Rick when Rick was back working as head of AI and CAD development at GE. And when they wanted to build a product, they would pay $1,000 per CT scan that had the information that they wanted. And you know, and they'd collect, you know, a couple of hundred cases, and they'd pay a couple of hundred thousand dollars to get the database, and that's how they do it. You know, when we're talking about building something around lung cancer screening, you know, there are hundreds of institutions have, you know, we have an LCAP, hundreds of thousands of scans already. In a sense, the most important part of the data, you know, it exists already. So, and the infrastructure to, at least the computer infrastructure for managing, by and large, exists. It would not take much to manage, to change it. You know, that's not a major investment. The major investment, I think, is sort of coordinating. You know, people that oversee the coming in of the data, you know, contractual with all the sites, that kind of thing.
David, just a thought. You mentioned NIH. I think there's other agencies outside of NIH that do this kind of work. That I think ARC, Agency for Healthcare Research Quality, is outside of NIH, under HHS. So the question is, do you view this as academic research or applied research? And I think we're at the point where this ought to be considered applied research.
Yeah, I like that thought a lot. I like that thought. National Library of Medicine is almost a consideration. They release data imaging databases also, where they house them. And that's, I assume, is outside.
But CMS, for example, or the Health and Human Services, there's a number of the administration of the CMS data goes through an organization called ResDac, which is housed at the University of Minnesota. So I think there's some really extensive experience on the administrative side and the applied side that might be worth considering.
So Medicare is involved directly with the University of Minnesota, you said? I mean, they housed and did a lot of the data for, I think, PLCO and many other large screening trials. Minnesota's been involved with handling the data. So they're quite expert at that. But I think these are all wonderful possibilities. Yeah, the idea of linking up somebody like Medicare with it, I think, is fantastic. You know, that's where I think the value comes, getting all of that data together. You know, you get drug data, events, hospitalizations, treatments, you get all of that. And that really starts to make this data set very valuable. I think that I've covered the topics that I wanted to cover today. Oh, measures of success. That was another topic about you know, Manuela brought it up. No, Heather brought it up for the giving of data. I really think that's an important topic. How do you judge the success of some of these efforts? And to an extent, it's, you know, how many publications come out of it. In this situation, you could look at how many products are developed, how useful the products are.
You can embed in the code of some programs everybody who's touched that program. So that if it's in any kind of digital images, you can embed those. But how you then use it to evaluate promotion?
Well, no, Heather had talked about, you know, for people giving their databases away and making them available to the public, they needed to get some credit for it in some way. And she was saying that that's an alternate method of getting credit by how the data is used by others. And it's an interesting thought. For this kind of database, how do...
Open source,
yeah.
Open source has a model for that. But each person who's touched that. So.
Yeah, but I'm saying I wanted to go, I think, a step further and say that, let's say we built this database, and let's say, you know, however it's managed, and now we should be able to track who's used it and what products were developed from it and what major publications came from it. Those, to me, would be the measures of success. You know, Jim Mulshine just published an article about the cell lines he did 30 years ago when he was at NIH with Adi Gazdar and John Minna, and they created a few hundred cell lines, and it turned out that literally hundreds of thousands of papers and have been, you know, citations from these cell lines that they created 30 years ago, and it's really been the most productive area in oncology. You know, certainly for lung cancer. The amount of useful information that came out of those cell lines that they created. He published an article on it just recently. And I think that's the kind of thing that if we were to build a database like this, we would want to track something like that to see just how beneficial it is. I guess the only other question we have is who would support something like this? Is this something, you know, that we would seek to get grants? Do we seek to get philanthropic donations? You know, I don't, you know, something like, I mean, we could scope out a cost, but I suspect it is not that big. You know, not that big, meaning, let's say $20 million, $10 million to get this up and running. You know, Midrick is up and running for $20 million. Well, it's only 2 years. Yeah. Well, anyway, I think those are some of the things that we would want to consider. We'd certainly have to scope out a cost, but I suspect this could be a consortium of groups that would want to be involved if we were to do this. You know, organizations like Prevent Cancer, maybe American ALA might be interested in being involved. Go-To Foundation. You know, I think these are all organizations that would be very supportive of something. Even groups like Kiba, for example, would want to be involved in something like this. So those are my thoughts for this topic. Does anybody in the audience have any further comments for us because otherwise we can end this a little early, and Rowena will put together all the slides for me and present this tomorrow. So if that's the case, then we're good. So any thoughts from anybody else, or we're good? I have one Q&A there. No. How can we participate in the VA corporate warehouse as a non-academic facility to develop AI for lung nodule detection? Is there a point of contact that you can share? Drew, are you still there?
Yeah, I would just connect with your closest lung precision oncology program site. And I can send you the link to the website. If it's not intuitive, just I'll also give you my email. And I think that the local relationships are very important to do that. Dr. Henschke, would you give any alternative recommendations?
Claudia
No,
is not,
that sounds good. I don't have any additional ones.
Okay.
And here's my email address. Just contact me directly if you need any help. Happy to be a guide.
Okay, then. So we'll see everybody tomorrow. We'll summarize this in the last session. And thanks everyone for hanging around for so long. See you tomorrow.
These things hurt after a while.